Yep, it's another video on BookTube about Junji Ito's Uzumaki, the incredibly famous Japanese horror manga. Will I have anything unique to say about it? Probably not, but I suppose we'll find out. Welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today I want to talk about Uzumaki, which I believe is the first manga that I've actually read. I've read quite a few graphic novels, but I think this is my first proper manga. And the reason why I've strayed away from the genre of manga is because I really don't like anime, which I know is something I probably shouldn't say on YouTube, but I've tried so many different animes and I just can never get into them. But I've been in the mood for some horror recently and Uzumaki kept coming up, so I figured I would give it a try. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was incredibly smart, and I think it veered into the literary, whatever that is, the literary. It veered into that realm quite a few times in ways that I thought were really interesting, and I thought it'd be worth talking about. If you're somehow unfamiliar with Uzumaki, it takes place in a coastal town on Japan called Kurozusho, where a bunch of strange things start happening. Spirals begin appearing everywhere, and people become obsessed with them. And these spirals, well, spiral out of control as they begin to infiltrate people's lives in ways that are entirely out of people's control. A potter notices that all the pots that come out of his furnace have all of these spirals all over it. One girl, her hair begins kind of spiraling and it seems like it has a mind of its own. And all of these other characters begin transforming slowly into snails with their spiral-shaped shells quite visible. There's really some Kafka-esque horror going on here. But each chapter in here focuses on different ways that the spiral manifests itself in this village. Some of these chapters are more psychological in nature and others are more supernatural. But what I really liked about this manga is its depiction of horror, especially in its depictions of both eco-horror and cosmic horror. And I don't really want to get into the nitty-gritty of genre here, but basically what I mean when I say cosmic horror is this exploration of how terrifying the unknown is, right? In the Lovecraftian sense, or in some ways more recently, in the Knausgaardian sense. I've been reading Knausgaard recently. And with eco-horror, I simply mean the fear that humans have of the natural world. Something which is becoming, I think, increasingly popular and increasingly pressing as the effects of climate change kind of make itself known. But with this kind of horror, eco-horror, the story is less focused on the Anthropocene than it is on the larger ecology in which humans exist. And this often means that things like the human-animal binary is blurred, climate disasters are more prominent, etc. And this kind of horror often feels very post-human in ways that I find very, very interesting. Junji Ito in Uzumaki blend these two sort of subgenres of horror. And of course, there is psychological horror and kind of sociological horror, if that's even a thing, in this book. But I don't think that this manga is focused on character by any means. The psychology of the characters, in my opinion at least, matter far less than the larger implications of the ecology in which these humans live. The human characters are merely affected by these cosmological and ecological events. They are neither the focus nor the target. And in fact, in Uzumaki, I would argue that the characters are almost entirely background. We don't really get any character development, and with outside of our few kind of main characters, there's very little to distinguish characters from each other. A lot of the characters seem very, very similar. Their individual personalities matter less than the larger sort of ecological consciousness of the town. And this isn't to say that the characters don't matter at all, of course, right? We do have a main character named Kiri, and her boyfriend, Shuichi, is also a recurring character throughout a lot of these stories. But the narrative, importantly, is never focused on them. It isn't focused on the psychology of the human. That being said, one of the scariest, or at least most disturbing parts of this manga is how the human bodies keep getting kind of mangled and destroyed and changed by the spirals. We see in the first story, the spiral obsession, which is perhaps the most straightforward episode in this manga. Shuichi's father becomes obsessed with spirals. They begin appearing around him and he begins just studying them intently. He'll find snails on the fence post and he'll just sit there and stare at it. He'll begin kind of studying whirlpools and things like that. And he just starts collecting these spirals. He begins putting them all around him inside of his house because at some point witnessing the spirals isn't enough for him. He has to join these spirals. So now, instead of just witnessing a whirlpool, he will make a whirlpool in his bathtub and then take a bath in it. He also begins curling up his tongue in very odd ways. And eventually, he disappears and everyone thinks that he's dead until they find him in a large tub curled up in a spiral. What's particularly disturbing is how the art style retains his human elements as it deconstructs it. It's one thing to change a human body into something else, but it's something else entirely to shift the human body into a new shape. It's like that scene from the Japanese movie Pulse, where the woman walks at the camera in a very disturbingly non-human way. The thing that makes it so scary is how she's both human and beyond human at the same time. And the effect here in Uzumaki, for me, is very much the same. The bodies in this town are constantly being pushed beyond the human. So, devastated by seeing what happened to her husband, Shuichi's mother sort of has a mental breakdown, and she begins fearing the most innocuous thing because she fears spirals. She'll refuse to eat noodles, for instance, because, well, they can curl up and look like a spiral. And this fear gets to the point where she begins fearing her own hair or her fingertips because, again, they can look like spirals. So she cuts off her hair and cuts off her finger. And her paranoia and fear go on, but I won't spoil everything. But the reason I bring this up is because these spirals begin inflicting people with a fear of their own bodies. And there is a very visceral bodily horror going on. And we see, as I noted earlier, that all of these bodies begin transforming into snails. This is disturbing enough as these characters are stripped of their humanity and put into a shell. But it gets way more disturbing when these snail people begin to be preyed upon by other humans, and the other humans begin eating these snail people. It's a form of kind of quasi-cannibalism, and I think it should make us, at least, it should make us question the morality of eating animals. Here, the difference between human and animal, or at least snail, is stripped away as people begin crossing the boundary between human and animal, and the border between human and animal is almost entirely dissolved. But this binary between humans and animals is also something that stories for millennia have explored, right? Think of any story about a werewolf or a mermaid or anything like that. But here in Uzumaki, it goes one step further and adds in this supernatural, or at least largely unnatural element of the spiral. Not only do the boundaries between human and animals get broken down, but they become contaminated with the spiral. And pretty early on, one of the first spirals to appear is the smoke coming out of the crematorium after Shuichi's father is cremated. And the smoke goes up into the sky and begins spiraling around. That is, the human bodies in death become spiral. And importantly, these spirals go up in the air and then they come back down and land in the center of the town in Dragonfly Pond, where, of course, it further contaminates the town. It's not the most subtle metaphor for pollution, but it's certainly one of the strangest. But by the end of this manga, the spiral moves beyond the bodily and into the cosmological. There's clearly Lovecraftian influence going on here, but there's also a pretty interesting similarity between Uzumaki and The Morning Star by Knausgaard, which I just recently read, so perhaps that's just why I'm thinking of it. But in both Uzumaki and The Morning Star, there is this Dantean descent into hell. But here in Uzumaki, the descent into hell is more of a descent into another world, another kingdom, where the spiral is king. And interestingly, Dante's hell is also a spiral, as Virgil leads Dante down layer by layer. And with each spiral, they come closer to Satan, who is, of course, at the very center of the spiral, frozen solid. Unfortunately for the characters of Uzumaki, there is no climbing back out of the Inferno and climbing of Mount Purgatory. And in fact, there's really no end to the story in Uzumaki. The spiral just goes on and it never seems to close. And what I find so interesting about this is nothing is ever explained in Uzumaki. And it actually seems like the characters in the story don't care to even try to explain it. Because it's an episodic manga, there are a ton of different stories in here, and some of them are related, but a lot of them don't really relate too much. There are characters who carry over, but it seems like when we move between episodes, everything from the previous episode is forgotten. That is, a terrible event will happen, the characters will deal with it, and then that episode will end, and we move to the next one. And by the time we get to the next one, no one really cares about the horror that just happened. Mostly everyone has just simply moved on. There's one character who becomes obsessed with these events, and that is Shuichi, whose parents were devastated by the spirals, but no one takes him serious, and in fact, they all kind of think of him as raving mad. So interestingly, instead of following characters who try to stop this event from happening, like we would perhaps in another version of this story, we follow characters who just kind of passively accept these events happening to them. They're simply affected by it. Occasionally they try to help or they try to leave town, but they're completely incapable of doing so. And this sort of learned helplessness is really palpable. I mean, being an American living in the 21st century where there's a mass shooting or a wildfire or some other terrible tragedy every other day, it seems. This all sounds just eerily familiar, just passively and helplessly witnessing the world spiral out of control and transform into something else while you just sit incapable of doing anything. I don't know. Is it just me? Anyways, it goes without saying that the artwork in this manga is just incredible. It's visceral and grotesque in the best ways. It's sort of outside of my wheelhouse to comment further on the artwork, but I really, really enjoyed it. I find a lot of horror to be quite stale, but I really enjoyed how Uzumaki blended kind of different genres of horror with the eco horror and the cosmological horror and some of the sort of bodily horror that this manga explores. I think it's smart in the best ways, but it made the horror more compelling, but more importantly is it made the ecological philosophy behind this story much more compelling. The blending of eco horror and cosmic horror effectively show how the ecosystem and the cosmos, at least from the perspective of the human, are really the same thing. But let me know what you think of Uzumaki, and let me know if you've read any of Junji Ito's other works. I'm really interested to check out more of his stuff. But for now, thanks for watching.